evening, everyone, from a wintry and blustery Dublin. I hope wherever you are is a bit calmer, or if you're in Dublin, that you're safe indoors. My name is Ciarán Wallace, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. The Virtual Record Treasury is based at the Department of History here in Trinity College Dublin, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Trinity Long Room Hub for the third in our series of conservation conversations. The Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland is a collaboration between historians, archivists and computer scientists, and key for this evening's proceedings are partners in conservation and conservation science. The work we all work on together, collaborating, is to reconstruct the collections of the Public Record Office of Ireland that were destroyed in the terrible fire and explosion back in 1922, when 7 centuries of Irish records went up in a single afternoon. And it's our job to reconstruct digitally, as far as possible, as many of those collections as we can. Our hosts this evening are our wonderful colleagues in the Trinity Long Room Hub. The Trinity Long Room Hub is Trinity's research centre for the arts and humanities. The hub runs a number of exciting and interesting programmes. It has fellowships and public engagement activities to aid researchers at all career stages. And it hosts new initiatives to show the centrality and the significance of arts and humanities-led research. The hub also provides inclusive programs of free public events, such as this evening's event, both online and in person. And it has an extensive back catalogue of podcasts and videos. So I'd urge you, after this evening's conservation, maybe to go online to Google Trinity Long Room Hub events and to see that back catalogue, and coming shortly is the future events as well, of course, to join those. I'll now hand over to someone who's been deeply involved in the entire research project of the Virtual Treasury from the very beginning, my friend and colleague Zoe Reid. Zoe is the keeper and the head of collection care and public services at National Archives Ireland, and Zoe will guide us carefully through this evening's conversation. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Ciarán, and that was a lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be moderator of this evening's event because I feel it really provides an opportunity for us to champion one of what is largely sometimes the unseen work and the contribution that conservators have given to the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. By doing events like this, we're making it more visible and we're bringing it into the spotlight. So the role of conservators and conservation across the archival core partners, and they are the National Archives of Ireland, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and the National Archives of the United Kingdom. These are the conservators who for these institutions that you'll be hearing from this evening. Funded by the Irish Government and under the umbrella of the Decade of Centenaries, the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland is a digital humanities project, one that designed and rebuilt a destroyed archive. The Public Record Office of Ireland was destroyed at the outbreak of the Irish Civil War, and we'll hear a lot more about that later on. Since 2016, the Beyond 2022 research project worked to understand not only what was lost, but also to identify records that would act as surrogates for those destroyed archives. This has been overwhelmingly successful, and in June 2022, the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland was launched and has been freely accessible to the public since then. Much of the focus of the historical research team over the last few years has been on identifying records that act as surrogates for those destroyed in 1922. People looking for the words and wanting to read the text. But this is really only one part of the process. The project has been very fortunate in being able to turn to our colleagues in the conservation departments from across these 3 core partners. The event tonight showcases how conservators and conservation scientists are striving to uncover more about the archival records through their work and the different ways of looking, reading and seeing the written word. So we'll start our journey tonight in Belfast with Sarah Graham, Head of Conservation at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And Sarah's going to discuss the application of practical bench conservation by looking at the treatment she applied to Archbishop Swain's 15th century register, a very early example of paper being used to hold on to the records. Then we'll move to London, and Mark Vermeulen, Senior Conservation Scientist in the National Archives UK, will talk about using different types of light to help us reveal texts that can no longer be seen due to previous historic treatments. And then finally, we come back to Dublin, to where it all started, and we'll hear from my colleague Jessica Baldwin, Senior Conservator in the National Archives, who will be discussing the conservation work on the material that survived the destruction of the Public Record Office of Ireland and the challenges and limitations that can be faced. We will see a short video contribution from each of the three conservators and conservation scientists explaining their work. And this is also an exciting look behind the door of the conservation spaces. At this point, I would like to say a very big thank you to Paddy O'Connor, who has worked with everybody over the last couple of weeks to get these presentations ready for this evening. We then hope to have a lively discussion over the next hour, and we would like to invite you to add your questions into the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll get to those by the end of the session. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to my colleague in Belfast, Sarah, and invite her to present for us.
Great. So the conservation work being discussed this evening belongs to the collection deposited at Prony by the Archdiocese of Armagh. It spans from 1360 to the mid-19th century, and in total consists of over 17,000 documents and 400 volumes. An undoubted highlight of this collections are the registers relating to 7 archbishops. Here I'll focus on the conservation of Archbishop John Swain's register, which is third sequentially. It contains copy documents which give a fascinating insight into power dynamics in the 15th century, when Swain was primate of all Ireland, plus his personal register from his time as legal advisor at the papal curia in Rome and the Council of Constance. The use of paper, as Zoe was saying, is rare, especially before printing gained momentum in the second half of the century. It was an imported commodity from Italy and Spain, and we see that the trade links and the content of the register reflecting each other in the materials and the written word. Better understanding of this register is gained through documenting the physical evidence of the construction and use of the registers over the 6 centuries. We see at the bench as conservators a unique viewpoint that we can share with the public and researchers. The documents it contains will also be available more widely than before, as conservation treatment will consolidate the register sufficiently for digitisation. Another nice little link with this register is that D.A. Chart, who was Prony's first deputy keeper, that's what we call our director, published a translated summary in 1935, which fits in with our centenary year that we're celebrating now. Just before we watch the video, and I forget, can I thank the Archdiocese of Armagh for their permission to conserve and promote the work of the register, and the Virtual Record Treasury for their support in the conservation of both Swain's register and the 2 earlier registers, that of Archbishop Sweetman and Fleming. The medieval register of John Swain is a complex structure which has been added to and modified over 600 years. The conservation started with carefully documenting its condition and the materials and techniques used to create it. Mold damage had caused the paper text block to be particularly fragile. The paper folios were friable and disintegrating underneath the text, causing significant areas of loss. D.A. Chart, who published a translated summary of Swain's register in 1935, noted that earlier transcriptions of the register were able to show where the frail paper was now, as he called it, defective or illegible. Use of paper as a text block was particularly rare in the early 15th century. Without paper production in Ireland, it was sourced from across Europe. The ink was easily identifiable as iron gall, but checked for solubility, and also with bathophenathrylline indicator paper. This is used to see the extent of the iron to ions, and therefore the stability of the ink. Fortunately, these show that the ink was stable enough for aqueous treatment. The treatment itself required proper investigation to ensure that the method was safe and appropriate. Sample paper was made from the blotting paper pulp, and the strength of the consolidant, water content of paper, method of application, and studio materials were all tested. National Museums NI kindly took a 3D scan of the outside of the 1630 binding with the 400-year-old repairs. Quill tips, hair and sand were found in the gutter of the folios, which were probably remnants from the production of the translations. The spine leather was gently lifted, and the double-threaded stitching around the taut alum and leather supports was slowly unpicked. A diagram of the section structure records exactly how the folios are ordered and fit together, so a rebinding at the end is accurate. The register is formed of 4 books, which were washed as individual bifolios by slowly humidifying and then transferring them into a shallow bath. This removes ingrained dirt and the acidity from oxidation. Additionally, it hydrates the adhesive from historic repairs, making it easier to remove. The paper is then felt dry to remove some of the water content before the gelatin solution is applied. Once it has been fully dried, the tears and losses in the paper are infilled with kozo paper and wheat starch paste. Once all the folios have been repaired, the register will be resewn, digitised and rebound. This will provide open digital access through the virtual record treasury and physical access in the Prony reading room.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was lovely to see, and lovely to see all the different things that conservators get to see whenever they have to take something apart to do that conservation process. So one of the questions that came to mind after watching the video was, we see you in the video spending time kind of making treatment samples. So what qualities are you testing for in those materials before you actually start working on the 15th century register?
So I was very aware that three of the registers had already had repairs done to them, and whilst they were very suitable for the time that they were repaired, they wouldn't necessarily be techniques that we would use today. And so I wanted to be sort of quite transparent about the way that I went around testing the materials, because with a mixture of training, experience and research, you can formulate the treatment plan that you want, but nothing really beats seeing how the materials are interacting with each other. So for instance, with a gelatin, if the gelatin's too weak, then you're not getting the desired result for the level of intervention that you're carrying out. But if it's too strong, then the paper will want to stick to the interleaving layers rather than itself. And mouldy paper wants to stick to anything apart from itself because it's so powdery and friable, right? So it needs to be strong enough to hold that cohesive strength of the paper, but not become an adhesive, stick to anything else.
Okay.
So that was a really delicate balance. Yes, and then I was also looking at the way I was applying it as well. So you can add the gelatin as sort of the final bath whilst it's still wet and immerse it. I thought about spraying it, but you have to keep gelatin hot, so it becomes either very expensive or very fiddly very quickly, and there are 320 pages in the volume. So but brushing was really effective because I wanted the concentration of the gelatin to work when it was saturated. So you're getting the same level of you're not getting more gelatin on one page than another if it's saturated. You're getting a consistent amount of that gelatin consolidant. But also it means that there's no lateral drag from the brushes either. So yes, saturated solution of a 1.5 weight volume solution of gelatin applied with a nice brush.
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to ask you one other question, because just for the general public, why gelatine? Why is that being used? Why would a conservator use that? Is that something to do with the paper or to do with the inks?
Both.
Okay.
So gelatin's always sort of had a mystique in the studio that it works well with iron gall ink, right? And then sort of the data is backing that up more and more, that it's quite good at coating the cellulose fibers that are really being damaged to iron gall ink. So, it's good for the inks, but also the main reason I wanted to go with gelatin is because that is the traditional size that would have been used on the paper. So when you have the macerated paper pulp that you form the sheets out of, it would have been gelatin that would have been applied so that the ink wouldn't spread everywhere as soon as you try to write on it.
Okay, cool. And it was really interesting then to see in your video as well, Sarah, the things that you found in amongst the binding gutter as such, those little bits of quill or or thread or feathers. That again, just tell us that little bit more about when, and that's when you sort of said, even though they're written in the 15th century, then they came along in the 17th century and they did another kind of consolidated reconstruction binding and brought it all together, the 7 registers. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because there's no, there aren't 2 binding structures here. There is only the 1630 complete binding structure. So before that, you see these pinpricks that are different, different sewing structures in different places. So you might have sort of 3 pinpricks from stab sewing in one section, or you might have a cluster of pinpricks where they've kind of gathered the paper in a way that functions the same way that a staple would now. And so from the early part, so from 1418 through to sort of 1439, from the start of it being created right through to 1630, that first 200 years, the registers were known as gatherings. You know, there were gatherings of paper. They weren't one volume. There are 4 books now for that they're in this one register. And so it was only in 1630 that they were all sewn together, which is why that's the sewing structure that I've tried to replicate now.
Cool. And just before we move on and go to Mark and find out about his work, my final question is, so what stage is the treatment at now? Just very quickly, can you let people know what stage you're at now with it?
I think there should be a photograph somewhere of it the week before last, actually, as it was being said. So here we go. It's all in my face. I thought I was a bit of a genius because I figured out that it was the leather. These sewing supports have a leather core and then the tawed alum wrapped around them. And I thought the bit that would be laced into the board would be the bit that would be under tension when you were sewing on the frame. But actually it only works if it's the leather. So that's the leather sort of sewing supports going up and then the tawed alum wrapped around it.
Wow, excellent. That's really, really lovely to see. And I think that's a great place to leave it there and to move on and invite Mark to let us know about his work that he's involved with in the National Archives in Kew. Mark, hi.
Thank you, Zoe, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So I think Sarah gave us a great example of how benchwork conservation can provide a better access to the content of a document and help readers get a fuller understanding of what was reported in the document but is no longer accessible due to various reasons. However, intervention of the kind are not necessarily possible or even necessary for all collection items in order to get access to the content. And so I think this is when scientific analysis and especially scientific imaging can provide an alternative to those lengthy conservation interventions. And so some scientific imaging techniques can provide readers an enhanced access to items' content. Some techniques can be quite straightforward and are quite available in a lot of places. Other are a bit more specialized and may require some more computational work. But I think often they all allow to provide the readers, the historians, the conservators, or anyone looking at the document really with some answers. And so with that, I will let you enjoy the video that will explain some of that right now.
Illegible text is a common issue when working with historical documents, and retrieving it is not an easy task. The causes behind the loss of readability are extremely varied. They range from accidental obscuring caused by fire, water, or light damage to deliberate concealment through redaction. The reduced readability of historical documents can also be due to chemical damage, also referred as gold document. The process consists of applying oak gall extract, one of the components of iron gall ink, that will react with the remaining iron from the faded ink to mimic the appearance of the original ink. In the short term, it increases the clarity of the handwriting, but with time, the process ends up staining the parchment, turning it brown or blue, and conceals the original writing, making the document even less legible than it was to begin with. We use a method called UV-induced visible luminescence, or UV fluorescence, to reveal hidden text by increasing the contrast between the ink and the chemically stained parchment. However, this technique does not work for all documents. In some extreme cases, the UV fluorescence imaging does not provide better contrast. This is due to the similar composition of the stain and the ink. In such cases, we turn to advanced imaging techniques such as X-ray fluorescence imaging, or macro-XRF, and reflectance imaging spectroscopy, often referred to as hyperspectral imaging. Both techniques scan the surface of the document to create distribution maps of elements or pigments. The hyperspectral imaging helps visualize variation in light absorption across the documents. Macro-XRF, on the other hand, is looking at the elemental composition of the ink. By scanning the surface of the documents, we can image the distribution of the various elements and recreate the unreadable word. Often, these techniques do not provide an instant result, and, in order to enhance the readability of the text, we need to apply various types of complex algorithms to extract the text that could not be seen otherwise. With macro-XRF, one of the issues is the depth of analysis. Because the X-ray penetrates the document, we often image not only the text that we see, but also the writing from the back side of the page. This complicates the reading, and so, in order to read the obscured page, the elemental maps require some further processing to help the reader. When we deal with iron gall ink, we use the iron, sulfur, and chlorine component of the ink to separate the writing from front and back, making the unreadable readable. While this technique used to be niche and scarcely available, they are now much more affordable and are becoming more and more embedded in cultural institutions, allowing for more documents to be deciphered.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for that. It's always fascinating and amazing to see what multispectral imaging can do. Those different colored versions of the document that we just see in black and white. It's a real treat. It's very exciting as well to think about those possibilities. So how do you decide which is the best analytical tool to apply in order to enhance and recover text that is unreadable?
So that's actually a very tricky question because I don't think there is an answer fits all. I think the actual what will guide the technique to be used is going to be the document itself. Either the type of ink that has been used, the type of why the document is unreadable. And so, for example, when it comes to hidden, like iron gall ink that cannot be seen because it contains iron, the use of macro-XRF, which is elemental technique, we will be able to see the iron pretty easily, and then that can be used to kind of extract the ink localization within the scan. When it comes, for example, there was an example in the video of the redaction that was basically black on black. Those will be probably very similar carbon-based inks that won't be able to kind of show up very well in macro-XRF. And so that's when hyperspectral imaging that will look at slight differences in color within the inks may be able to kind of separate all of like the two different inks. And so I think, yeah, the nature of the redaction, the nature of the materials that is not readable is the one thing that kind of drives us to use one or the other, or both actually, techniques.
Okay, and before we go on, I've got another question around the main challenges that you encounter. But one thing I want to ask, because I'm really curious, it's like, when did they put this other ink on top of the ink? When was that a common practice, and why did they think it would be successful? I suppose.
So it's a practice that was very common in the 19th century, and I think they thought it was very successful because it was very successful. When you apply it, it really kind of brighten up the ink, but does not necessarily do anything on the short term to the parchment itself. With time, though, that's when everything goes dark. And so I think on the short term, it worked very well in the years it was used. And so that's why it kept being used over and over and over again. And so now when we get access to those documents, we have all of that, and most of them were done in the 19th century. And some of them, we have some example at TNA where the pieces of parchment were mounted in books. And then after they were mounted, you can see that the galling has been done after they were bound in the book. So it's really something that happened quite a lot, even in places that you would not necessarily expect it. It's because at the time it was kind of the way to kind of reveal what could not be revealed. Thankfully, over time we have other ways to do it now. So
yeah, that's true. And I suppose from a point of view in Ireland and looking at the collections that would have been in the Public Record Office of Ireland, I suppose what strikes me is I think of the National Archives collection and I go, oh, we don't have anything like that. But probably, unfortunately, we might have, but they then might have been subsequently destroyed in that fire in 1922. So it's not something I'm familiar with in terms of something to come across in terms of looking after the collections and trying as a challenge, trying to figure out a way to reveal that text. So going back to my other question, what are the main challenges for you when you encounter these techniques for text recovery?
So I think the main challenges come from the size of the documents. I mean, you're very well aware that and we've seen a few images of how big some documents can be, how stiff they can be, and so you cannot necessarily open them fully. Most of those techniques are a bit, so I think that's the shape of the document, the shape of the instrument will kind of have an impact on what can be accessed and what cannot be accessed. And I think this is when the main challenge kind of arises to kind of choose which technique and to kind of apply that technique to the document. And then the other challenge is obviously access to those techniques. Those techniques are not necessarily found everywhere. And so yeah, having an access to those techniques is something that is primordial for text recovery. And then because they require a lot of computer power and those complex algorithms, I think that's when collaboration with computer scientists, with data scientists is key. I think we'll hear a bit more later on, but I think, yeah, challenges is kind of creating a network and having access to the instrument and figuring out the physical aspect of the document and what can be done with it.
And have you found, Mark, I'm just interested, have you found any limitations or drawbacks when using those imaging techniques?
I mean, there are always limitations. I think there were limitations whenever they were applying this galling, and obviously we have limitations now. And most of the limitation again come from the materials that were used. Again, if they use the same materials in what was used to back in the day enhance the color, and it's something that cannot be separated with XRI, for example, or cannot be separated with hyperspectral imaging, because some of the images that I've shown in the video, but I have many other examples, the color between the parchment that became black or brown and the ink is actually, it's the same color. So the techniques won't kind of be able to pick up the differences in them. And so I think when we kind of face this, what needs to be done is working with those computer scientists that can kind of create some like those algorithms that can do magic. And I think this is when those collaborations with those niche kind of profession that were not necessarily something that we thought could be of interest to them, nowadays become something of interest that we can kind of work with them to retrieve all of that. And so hopefully in the next 20-50 years we'll be able to recover even more than what we can do right now.
I think your key point there is collaboration. And I mean, that's one of the things that's been very, very strong all the way through what was Beyond 2022 and then morphed into the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, was that cross collaboration with all the multi-disciplines that are involved. And I mean, that's the strength that we're seeing, and that in many ways is going to be one of the major legacies of the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, was actually just getting everybody who had different ways of looking at things or thinking about things coming and working together. So it's really great for us, as I know, conservators, to have the opportunity to work with conservation scientists and heritage scientists in that way, as opposed to sometimes just perhaps being siloed. It's fantastic, and that's been a massive development and a very exciting one as well.
Yeah, and if I may add one little thing, I think for us it's been key as well, because when I do the analysis on those documents, like I can retrieve some letters that are not readable otherwise, but I cannot read them. And so for me, like, because it's Old English, it's a writing I'm not used to, but working with the historians who are used to kind of what the content of those documents actually helped me a lot, making sure that what I do is good enough for them to actually recover the words. And so I think, yeah, again, this collaboration with the historians is also key to make sure that what we do is enough, or we need to do more.
Yeah, and it's also really enjoyable as well. There's a real thrill of, even if you've conserved something, then seeing a historian read it. And I mean, as I say, we read things in a different way as conservators, but to see a historian then read the words and you know that you've enabled that, is actually, that's a hugely satisfying part of our work, essentially. So listen, Mark, I'm going to take the hot spot off you, and we're going to move back round our tour around the UK and Ireland, and we're going to head to Dublin, back to Jessica Baldwin. But thank you very much. So Jessica, thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to hand over to you. You're going to talk about, obviously, the Public Record Office salvaged material from 1922. And for those who know me, know that it's also a collection I'm very familiar with, and the work that I've done in the past sort of 5 or 6 years. But I have a question for you, maybe before we see your video, if you don't mind. I'm interested here, what do you think were the main challenges of dealing with that original material that was salvaged from the rubble?
I think that's interesting, because as Mark was touching on, really enabling that safe access to collections is really central to all the work that we do as conservators. And what is sometimes most challenging is for a conservator to accept that there are certain items that are just beyond traditional conservation techniques, making them inaccessible. And the salvage operation by the Public Record Office staff in 1922 took nearly a year to complete. And I explained this at a talk I gave last year. And one of the questions from the audience that surprised me was, how did the staff decide what to save? And the answer to that is they didn't. They simply saved everything they found, every scrap of paper and parchment. Thankfully, no matter how badly charred and beyond repair it might have appeared. And really, their actions have enabled the records to survive. Until now, in fact, when we're just starting to explore how we might tackle the challenge and potentially make these records that seemed completely inaccessible and beyond hope accessible. So that's the focus of our short film that hopefully we can share now.
Thank you.
Casualty of Ireland's Civil War, the Public Record Office of Ireland was destroyed on the 30th of June 1922, resulting in the loss of 700 years of Irish history. 3 weeks after the explosion, the Public Record staff were granted access to begin the momentous task of retrieving documents from the rubble of the building. The fact that any record survived the impact of the blast is extraordinary. They spent nearly a year gathering, sorting and identifying over 25,000 sheets of paper and parchment, which were carefully wrapped in brown paper and labelled. The salvaged collection remained in safe storage until a few years ago, when the National Archives of Ireland here in Dublin began a programme of conservation.
condition surveys found that unfortunately over 20% of the collection was so badly damaged that it could not be treated with traditional conservation techniques. However, thanks to ongoing collaboration with conservation scientists in Ireland and the UK, we have been exploring the possibility of using technology to reveal the hidden history held within these records. Supported by the Dental Institute at Queen Mary University of London, Dr. David Mills has scanned this fragment using X-ray microtomography or micro-CT. Dating from 1406 to 7, this fragment from a parchment plea roll is one of only 3 original rolls that survived the King's Bench, which was the court of the King of England's representative in Ireland. Thanks to the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland project, we know that the plea rolls were stored on the 3rd floor. It is likely that this roll was blown out of the building by the explosion, and fire damage has fused the parchment together in places. The high contrast, high dynamic range scanner allows the imaging of small differences in X-ray absorption between inks and the material upon which they are written. It provides us with cross-section images through the plea roll, revealing for the first time the remnants of at least 20 parchment membranes sewn head to head and tightly rolled around a wooden dowel. The iron particles in the ink show as bright flashes in contrast to the non-reflective parchment below. The images can then be manipulated using computational flattening algorithms to reconstruct the text. The results of this first trial are extremely promising, as letters are clearly visible, holding out the tantalizing possibility of virtually unwrapping parchment rolls that cannot be made accessible through conservation, and potentially recovering text thought to be lost forever.
There we go. I've unmuted myself. Thank you, Jessica. That was great to see. And those images at the end of the X-ray tomography are really such a thrill to actually see what it looks like, and you know, just to see how many layers of parchment are wrapped around that dowel. But like me, you trained as a paper conservator, focusing on the repair of collections. So how challenging is it to adapt to the growing use of technology in conservation?
Well, yeah, you're right. As conservators, we're trained to how to physically intervene and treat collections, kind of following a strict professional code of ethics. But really, what is equally important is to be keenly aware of the limitations of our own skill. Really, in order to prevent putting items that we're caring for at risk. And the introduction of these sort of non-destructive techniques is really exciting for me as a conservator. Rather than a challenge, I see it as an exciting additional tool, because I'm conscious that my understanding of the science behind the technology that we've been discussing is limited. But that's why collaboration with specialists such as Mark at the TNA and Dr. David Mills at Queen Mary University of London is so important. And as you touched on just before, really from the start, the Virtual Record Treasury project has been really exciting to provide that opportunity to collaborate and learn from other partners involved, as we've mentioned, historians, computer scientists, archivists, scholars, conservators, and we're all bringing a unique set of skills to share. I'm kind of fascinated really with wondering how the Public Record Office staff, if they ever thought when they were carefully parceling a century ago, those meager remains of the collections that they knew so well. I wonder what they might have thought when they to see that now there is a possibility of what they so carefully saved, that maybe we can access it and bring it back to life in a modern age. So it's kind of exciting. So I think certainly embrace technology, but with an awareness that my understanding is limited. Even my ability to say X-ray microtomography or computational algorithms took some practice. So I think it's a really exciting time for heritage and conservation and projects, really.
I fully agree with you, and actually I think that's a good place to bring both Mark and Sarah back into the conversation, if you're happy with that. Other than to say, I think there has to be a prize to go to all three of you, in the sense of the difficult words that you managed to get into your presentation and to be able to say them. I am not going to try and do any of them, but each of you seem to find a uniquely difficult phrase or turn or sort of description of something that you had to say. But it's been lovely throughout the course of the evening and watching the videos. I mean, Sarah, you engaged with colleagues in the Northern Ireland Museum to do a 3D scan imaging of your binding. Mark, to see the work that you're doing, and now Jessica, to see that collaboration with Queen Mary University in London. It is an exciting time to be a conservator and to look at the collections that we're caring for, but then also to see what else can we discover. And I think that these techniques and tools are becoming more readily available. They're not so cost prohibitive now, and that there are ways that institutions are sort of being able to support that research and work. And I don't know if any of you would like to kind of jump on in there and say anything about that and sort of the availability of these techniques.
Sorry, I was going to say, yes, Sarah, the 3D scanning, how did that come about? And yeah.
Well, yeah, there was a very generous offer by the National Museums NI to come through and to spend a couple of hours scanning the volume before I did any work on it, because I was really mindful of the fact that through treatment the visual appearance of the volume will change, but the way that it was is so important. It's going through a new transitional moment, right? But you want to keep as much of the way that it was known before. So yeah, it was a 3D scan. You turn it around and see it from all angles, exactly the way that all the pages had sort of snuggled together. And then I took it apart, washed it, and I've tried to sort of put it all back in all of its wonkiness. But we've now got the before and the after as carefully documented as possible.
Yeah, for me, I wanted to kind of go on to the whole question about availability. And I think this is something that the field in general has worked quite a lot. And the funding bodies have played a major role in that as well, because while the techniques got more and more affordable, the funding bodies also recognized heritage science and conservation science as one of the topic to invest in. And so, for example, also the AHRC in the UK has put a lot of effort into recognizing heritage science as like taking on heritage science. And then the government has put in place this massive research infrastructure for heritage sites in conservation, which will also allow more institutions to have access to those high-end techniques through projects. And so I think this is where the field is going, and I think we have to thank all the players in that, including the funding bodies, which makes all of those techniques, difficult or not, much more accessible to everyone.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point about funding, but it's also that idea as well. We can be funded to do this work, but we actually have to be able to articulate it and demonstrate it and show it back to both the public, both the funding organizations and our institutions as to the value of it. And that, I think, is a really important role as well in terms of advocacy. that conservators and conservation scientists really have to do. That's why events like tonight are really important, because it gives us that platform to say, okay, yes, you funded this work, and look, this is the results. And okay, it might be baby steps, or it might be really early on in the process, but that's how things grow and develop. And I know, for example, I read an article that was published by David Mills and the National Museum in Wales, and that then got me excited, thinking, oh gosh, I wonder if that would have possibilities for materials within our collections. And so by sharing that knowledge, that's how it grows and how people connect with each other, and that's hugely valuable.
Sorry,
Jessica?
I should credit that David is actually attending and listening in today, so we're delighted to have him listening in. He's just returned for a long trip, so it's wonderful to have him here.
Excellent. We've got some questions, guys, from the audience. If you're kind of happy to kind of look at some of those and maybe chat to see what people are interested in. There's a great question, which is, I suppose it's really for everybody. It's given the tragic physical reason for recreating the archive, the important archive, what role does digital preservation play in the collections? And I suppose that's really looking at the virtual record treasury, which is becoming, you know, the work that we're doing is maybe going on to the virtual shells in the virtual record treasury. So that idea of digital preservation for collections, have you guys thoughts or opinions on that?
I think it's really exciting because very few people speak Latin, right? So the fact that Swain's Register is mostly in Latin means that it's kind of an artifact if people want to come to the reading room and look at it, unless they know Latin. And with Charles' translated summary, it's great that it's in English, but it's still a summary. So it's working with the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, they're pulling out stories and pulling out topics that are in the book, in the registers, in a way that we couldn't really do it before. You know, that we wouldn't have been able to have done had Pony not been part of this partnership. So it's really exciting to have the Virtual Record Treasury. Yes, yeah. There's a poem about women and hats, which is delightful.
I think it's an exciting opportunity for the National Archives to highlight that collection distinct from its more modern collections, and really focus, and that the introduction, again, going back to, as you say, the introduction of AI and that transcription opportunity is really exciting, and has so many applications across all collections, really, especially archival questions where the languages or it create such a barrier to allow people to access the content in such an interactive and visual way. There's so many different ways into the data that's held on the portal that it's really exciting.
Yeah, it is.
I think there was a question, I know, that about why haven't we conserved?
Yes.
Items.
Well, I read it out. Yeah. So somebody's asked, so why were the salvaged items not conserved before now? And did any further degradation take place during those intervening years? And so that definitely is one for Jessica. And I think there's one popping up a bit later that's directed for Sarah as well. So Jessica.
Yeah, I think, well, there was what's interesting is that when the salvage operation happened, they carefully documented and parceled everything in brown paper, what was readily available to them, tied them up with string and labeled them. And for a conservator, I'm actually quite relieved that a lot of work wasn't carried out in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, in fact, because there were a large number of techniques which have now been proven to be non-reversible. I mean, similar to the galling that Mark was talking about, these well-intentioned applications adhesives, silking, nylon. All these things were seen as a bit like the introduction of sellotape, a shining example of how you can immediately repair and restore. But it was only after time that we realized the detrimental effects that this intervention has on the collections. So for the archives and Zoe was central to the first project that started unwrapping those parcels in 2016 and 17. The items were literally held almost in sort of in status. They were protected, they were clean, almost frozen in time. So no, I haven't noticed any further detrimental evidence of anything happening, because they've been preserved and maintained in good, stable environments. And certainly for conservation, it's much easier to start at the point, the untouched, century on position. But obviously the condition of things does make it challenging.
It definitely does. And I think it's fair to say as well, just with the little bit of knowledge that I have about the collections, that certain things were taken out over that span of 100 years, and things were conserved, or treated or sort of repaired sort of in the 30s, the 40s, and in the 1970s as well. But the majority of the stuff wasn't. It was left alone, and as Jessica said rightly, well cared for in a good, stable environment. And the paper did exactly what it was meant to do. It protected the documents, it kept the dust and light off them. So yeah, we're very, very glad that they did it, and very thankful of the work that was done. I'm just now going through the other questions. We got a lovely comment from Mr. Kieran Wallace, who says that we historians are also delighted and excited to work with the conservators and the conservation scientists. Thank you very much, Mr. Wallace, for that. We're delighted too. And again on, my apologies. Okay, so, on the storage of digital images. So sorry, I'm just reading this out, so let's just see what it says. And following on from that, what storage capacities are necessary for the creation and ongoing storage of the files created, in terms of, I suppose, I think that digital repository that the virtual record treasury has become, in that sense. So yeah, if anybody has any thoughts or comments, maybe Mark from the conservation scientist end, a few in terms of digital.
So yeah, when it comes to all of those techniques that obviously create a lot of data that we want to keep for future generations to get access to, whenever better AI tools will be there to kind of get more information out of it, it obviously creates issues when it comes to storage and how much should be stored, in which condition it should be stored. This is something that the field in general has been looking into. It is something that, again, the riches infrastructure that we're trying to put in place in the UK is looking into. We are hoping to be able to get those like online repositories where we can share data for the long term on that. And so this is something that is being researched. Solutions are being looked into, but I don't think it's an easy answer. I don't think there's any easy answer, because behind all of that there is all of the environmental issue of, if you store in the cloud, you have to cool down. So yeah, it's all kind of finding the right balance between creating files enough to get information, but not too much that it is redundant and create more, well, issues than it gives answers. So I think it is the right balance to have, to just try to answer the questions with what we have right now, hoping that it can be conserved for the future generations.
Exactly, and of course we're holding on to the original records as well. I mean, you're taking photographs of the original records,
Yep.
But in terms of digitalization, the original records are held onto, and again that digital surrogate that's perhaps created to go onto a platform such as the VRTI is that way of just enabling and increasing access, which is hugely important. And I think that's probably that whole digital platforming of collections has probably been one of the biggest things to see our profession change over the last 15, 20 years. And for the better, very much so. We've a very specific question in for Sarah from Prony, and it's about now. Okay, Sarah, I'm not a bookbinder, so here goes. Is take your time. Is cross-stitched binding considered appropriate from a conservation viewpoint? I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of Prony's T550 old age pension forms, which were stitched where the edge of the original double side is very technical, double side form bindings stitched into the original forms and the fields of information. What would be recommended if the documents were being conserved for the first time? So that's somebody with a big in-depth knowledge of some of the collections in Prony.
Thank you very much for the interest in Prony's collections. I'm not entirely sure what they mean by cross-stitched bindings. I think some of our transcript collections, because T numbers are transcripts, and when Prony sort of was founded 100 years ago, one of the first things was the Prony staff would go to other collections and transcribe to build the Prony collections. So I think David Huddleston's on the line, he might know. But a lot of our transcripts have stab stitched bindings. So again, where you're stitching through the pages and not on the spine where it can open fully. What I would first of all think of is why was it stitched and who stitched it? So if there's a reason for it to be stitched, for instance, I was conserving the Government of Ireland Act a year or so ago, and there it had been stapled together so it couldn't really open. And so I replaced that with thread, so it still had the original type of binding, as it were, but it could open. And so there may be something behind the history of the stitching which we'd have to be careful of and not losing that information in our aim to get at the information. But no, if we're approaching something very new for the first time, we would do so in a way that's respectful of all of the information, because as we work in archives, that's the main thing, is the access to that unique information that archives hold.
It is. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that. Okay, we've one other question. Oh, I'm actually seeing a little sign that says 4 new messages, but I'll stick with this one. And it's for Jessica. What and perhaps David Mills, if you can pop something into the chat or the Q&A. So was the scanning and flattening algorithm to recover the original text developed for this particular project, or had it been used before?
No,
Jessica.
it's definitely been used and developed before by David Mills on a number of different projects which have been, widely publicized. I am just going to give David a chance to reply via.
Well, actually, there's a response here from David, and I think it's going back to that idea of the digital images and the size of them. So David has sort of said, going back to the point that Mark was making, the X-ray data from my scans is about 10 to 100 gigabytes. We store that on Queen Mary's servers and have a plan to upgrade that soon. Funding is in place. That's just for backup we store, not necessarily for displaying to people. So that's, again, going back to Mark, the point you were making about the digital images that are being created, the size of them and how we have to look after them. But that's a very good point from David. It's like there are 2 types of storing and sharing this information. There's one for the internal use, but then how do you platform that if you need to for the display them to the public? So.
And he's also added that scanning and flattening was developed by Queen Mary University and colleagues at the MIT. And that, that technology is constantly evolving and, being improved.
Excellent, thanks, Jess. And I think here's a really good one. Just as we've had quite a lively discussion, and here's a good one to everybody. How do you think conservators of the future are going to view this work? It's a good general one.
As obsolete.
I hope not.
Well, I'm sure by the, like, it depends when, but I'm pretty sure 50 years, 100 years from now, at least from the scientific standpoint and the scientific techniques that were used, they will look quite good, but still kind of old-fashioned, because I'm certain that a lot of work will have been put in place to kind of do better than what we can do today. So and that is the analysis that are being done, not the treatment that is being done on the item. That I'll let the other answer.
Yeah. Jessica.
So how do you think conservators? Well, I think certainly with obviously the project I presenting as I hope that they will look favorably on it, and because really the exciting thing for us is to be able to try and access this material without causing any damage, and that's always our key with any treatment that we do, and certainly with this material that is that's sort of beyond current conservation techniques. I would hope that they would approve, and as Mark said, see it as an important first step in a process. You know, even if we think how powerful our cameras are on our mobile phones, which would have been impossible to even think about that when we were studying at college, to think that we'd have this readily available in our hands. Obviously, the technology, and I think multispectral imaging is becoming so much more accessible. I don't think CT scanning, but who knows, maybe in 40 years time. I hope that won't be daily available to everybody, but yeah, I think I'd hope they think that we at least started down this way of using technology in this way.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Jessica, you started off by saying, you know, as conservators, we're bound by a code of ethics in terms of making sure that everything we do in terms of our treatment choices are fully reversible and documented, and documentation is key to what conservators do, and that very much does give people the opportunity to look back, even ourselves, look back and reflect the work that we've done and look at those treatments. And you and I both have had that example of looking back to conservation work that was done in the 1970s and acknowledging it for what it is, sort of saying, well, we wouldn't do it this way now, but it's still functioning, it's still working the way it was intended to work in terms of preserving the document and making the information accessible. And Sarah, I know you've talked about this at conferences before, about his previous historic kind of conservation work that's done. So I suppose it is interesting to pose that idea of how do we think that people might think about the work that we're doing now?
I hope that they think the work that's been carried out now is considered and careful and thoroughly documented, as you were saying. And the binding that I'm sort of reconstructing, that I took apart and then I'm using most of it to put back together again, lasted for 400 years. And so with the registers now being in an archive, there's no reason why it couldn't last another 400 years, particularly with sort of the stability of the materials that we're using as well. One of the things I've spoken about before is the use of tracing paper as a repair paper in the early 20th century. And you can understand why that happened, right? If you had the option of opaque paper or translucent paper, you'd use the translucent paper because there's the possibility of seeing what's underneath, but it's very acidic and it does act as a catalyst of the deterioration of the ink. So, you know, you can see why it happened. You can see why they thought it was why it was considered a good idea, but also why maybe it's not the best thing to use now, and perhaps taking them back is a good idea, particularly with very old records.
Exactly. How's everybody doing? We've got some more questions. If everybody's still feeling like we can keep chatting for just a little bit longer, we've got some time, just a few minutes, but as we've still got some interesting questions, I just thought if you're happy to keep chatting, folks, we will. Okay, we've got one question here, a question for all the panelists. How do you see AI impacting the work that you're doing? And I suppose that goes and thinks about the transcription piece that we've mentioned before, that's been a key part of the virtual treasury.
I can go. So for me, I think AI is currently a powerful tool to actually extract more than what we can do ourselves. I think it still needs to be somehow guided. It still needs to be not controlled, but like it needs to be done in a controlled manner. But I think applying AI to what we do can allow us to get so much more information that what we as a field can give using those techniques. And that goes for what I presented in the video with the ink being on both sides and not being able to separate them, to easier identification of the words and translation of the word. Like we talked about the Latin before, I'm sure there is already on place something to kind of instantly read and translate, which gives the reader full content without like prior knowledge or full understanding of the actual document itself. So I think AI is definitely a tool to be reckoned with for the future, and I think it will give us so much more than what we can get right now.
Ladies, any thoughts on it? All I would say is at least it can read stuff hopefully better than we can.
If it could help me write condition reports, I'd be delighted. It's a part that conservators always hate. But no, it's fascinating, and even with our our current project of the 1926 census, to see how AI is already coming into looking at transcription for us. So really for access for the data, I think it's exciting, but I think you're always going to hope need the conservator and those bench skills.
Oh, definitely. I think there's never going to be a faster way, unfortunately, of doing some of the hands-on treatment that we do, and especially looking at the material that we work with. We've had lots of compliments, guys, in the Q&A from everybody just saying how much they've enjoyed this evening and how fascinating the talks have been. There is one question that's coming in that's trying to get me to say computational flattening algorithms. So, and it is for Jessica, and it's kind of, but perhaps it's something that David might chip in with as well. It's asking what kind of results do these algorithms produce initially? And do they produce a readable transcription of the document, or is it just shapes that then have to be interpreted and looked at in the lettering?
Well, my understanding is it breaks it down into letters that then can be flattened out into text, and then obviously you do need the archivist to make sense of what those words should be, what would be expected in the text, and what would be recovered from that. But it's sort of the initial jigsaw puzzle, and even obviously our colleague Peter Crooks was excited to see the initial results because he could start forming words himself, just seeing the little snapshot images that we included. And then obviously it takes the skill of the scholar and the historian to then piece together what's being shown through that scanning process.
Yeah. There's a comment from David in the Q&A, quite rightly too. He's saying, if you can't read the item, how do you validate the AI output? I'm skeptical. So he probably is quite right. There's a lot of learning still to do around AI or IA, depending on what to do. Oh, and no, my screen is not letting me go down further to see if I got another comment from anybody. Oh, David's just sort of saying the best result we can easily get is the black and white image of the ink and the parchment. Usually the ink is white, as we would have seen in the photographs that Jessica showed, and the parchment dark. We can progress further, but that's usually what people are happy with. So that's David just coming back in terms of the algorithms and looking at the results from the X-ray tomography. I think we're kind of coming to the close now, folks. It's been an excellent evening. I'll speak for everybody. I've thoroughly enjoyed all the presentations. I've loved having the opportunity to talk to you all and really find out so much more about the work that's going on at the minute and how that's feeding into that larger project of the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, which has been an amazing springboard for all these collaborations, this work, and getting sort of the interest behind all the work that we're doing. I just have before we say goodbye to everybody and thank everybody for their patience this evening, I have a couple of words of thanks. Just very quickly, I'd like to acknowledge the thanks and thank Christina Hamilton from the Trinity Long Room Hub, who has very much kept us on track this evening and made sure all those video presentations worked when they were meant to, and that you've been able to see and hear us all evening. And thank you so much for all your work in preparing for this evening, Christina. I'd also like to thank Jean-Philippe and Giovanni from the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, who has also kept us on our toes and brought us all together and organised this event. And of course, Deputy Director of the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, Mr. Kieran Wallace, I'd like to say a big thank you to you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody who joined us this evening. It's been a really real pleasure to get to talk conservation for a whole hour and a half. So thank you very, very much.